Okay, thank you and welcome to my talk. Do cultural ecosystem services matter in wetland protection? That's a very compelling title, and hopefully we can get to it in the next 13 minutes. Got a lot to say, so we're going to go fast. Ecosystem services, the working definition of that is that the goods and benefits that maintain human well-being. So let's think about that while we move through the rest of the talk. The Millennial Assessment came out in 2005, and they put these ecosystem services into four big categories: supporting, provisioning, regulating, and cultural. Supporting are things that ecosystems do that produce sink and source products. Provisioning is the raw materials that can benefit humans, like fiber and food. Regulating is how do they can buffer disturbances and produce quality and quantity of water and process waste. Cultural are the aesthetics and recreational educational benefits that these systems can produce. Now, Boyd came out in 2007 and said, no, hold on, these supporting services, these are just what ecosystems do anyway, regardless of whether humans are involved. They don't really meet this definition of maintaining human well-being, although they're an important step, an important intermediate step. It's these final services that we want to focus on: provisioning, regulating, and cultural. Now let's use an example. This woman's out fly fishing. What does she need to fly fish? She needs fish. Okay, that makes sense. She also needs an opportunity to go fishing. And when she has those two things put together, then she will buy fishing gear, buy licenses, and have a great day out fishing. Now this informs our kind of ecosystem service flow. Fish density is that intermediate services that allow for her to enjoy and engage in fishing. The opportunity to go in those is super important, and those two engage with each other to create this final service of recreational fishing. Now, all of that produces natural capital, and that engages with human capital to produce goods like fly rods and hotels and guides and restaurants and whatnot. And those all have monetary value, which has its own study to come up with assigning dollar values to those sort of things. Now there's other things that are more intrinsic and have cultural benefits. As she engages with the landscape, she achieves these benefits. Now humans being what they are, they will overuse these systems and create cumulative pressures. And then policy can regulate the impacts of those cumulative pressures by controlling access, reducing access, or increasing access, or doing something to increase fish density so that we can have a sustainable service. So that flow of information and action is kind of where I live, and this is another example of that sort of service flow where we have blue as a physical transfer of actions or things that are happening on the ground, where policy can drive the condition of the structure and the function of the ecosystem by doing restorations or enhancements or whatnot. And that will affect the sink and source products that the system outputs, which drives the ecosystem service themselves. Or we can look at the flow of information. It's kind of the world that I live in, that I work in, is the assessment of the condition of those ecosystems to see how well they're producing those intermediate services, or assessing, ideally, the condition of the service itself to see if it's meeting those needs. And that information can inform policy to decide how it's going to drive this system. So let's look at how ideas have changed across time in the zeitgeist of information, and how public mandates drive those sort of things. Now, this figure here, we looked at Digital Science Dimensions platform that looks at 110 million publications and grant applications and data sets, and to look at how the ideas of wetland function in this case changed across time, and then related to these mandates that have occurred for wetlands. In 1977, the Carter administration said we're interested in protecting wetlands in the United States. In 1990, there was a memorandum of agreement between the Army Corps and EPA that there would be no net loss of wetland functions and values. And then in 1995, they developed tools to rapidly assess wetland function. And then the compensatory mitigation rule, which compensates for unavoidable impacts to protected waters under the Clean Water Act so that we can maintain this no net loss of functions and values, kind of directs it. But this idea of functions rose on these points and showed up in the literature. Now values, now remember we're looking for no net loss of functions and values is an important part of the compensatory mitigation rule, but values was poorly defined and there was really no touchstone to go on. Ecosystem functions is as old as the science of ecosystems themselves, which is about 130 years old. So you could rely on this idea of ecological processes to perform functions, but values the literature wasn't really well defined and kind of languished across this time, whilst the idea of services, especially when the millennial assessment showed off, gave a real idea, a solid theoretical base to build this idea of what values means in terms of services, and that it's shown up in the literature and just taken off in the last decade or so, and has really been a focus of a lot of attention of ecosystems, and that's probably why you hear it in a lot of talks. Now, when I go out and I develop a rapid assessment tool, and I'm interested in seeing how I can go out and assess ecological function to meet this compensatory mitigation need, I can rely on the long history of ecosystems to come up with the types of processes that will occur in aquatic systems. And most scientists will agree with me because I have a large body of information to rely upon. And I know that these are pretty common ecosystem functions, and I can go out and rapidly assess the condition of those functions based on the structure that's in the system, and I can say, well, okay, 1's the best type and 0's the worst type, and then if I go and do some sort of regulated action, I can compensate for that based on this assessment. I want to do the same thing for ecosystem services, the same 1 to 0 relationship with my rapid assessment tool, and I can come up with a list of services, but I really don't know what those are. Like I don't have a body of literature to rely upon, so I don't know what the definitive list is. And it turns out that services are very bioregional or very community-based, and they change from place to place. So so our group looked at these classification schemes. There's the common international classification, there's the intergovernmental classification, and they think about all the different types of ecosystem services that are out there. We relied heavily on the final ecosystem goods and services classification tool that was replaced right at the beginning of this year with the National Ecosystem Service Classification System. Now there was a final ecosystem goods and services query tool that's been replaced with this one, but what I'm reporting is the little older version. They're really not that different, but what we asked in the query tools, we said, okay, we're interested in spatial components. Now it queries all sorts of things, but we're interested in aquatics, wetlands, rivers, and lakes, and the terrestrial that's adjacent to it, so forest and ag. And then we're also interested in the ecosystem intermediate services that come out from the soils and the water, and that's part of the query tool. And then who's going to engage in this? And then when we loaded all that into the query tool, they said, okay, here's 204 potential ecosystem services that exist based on what you said you're interested in. Now that's a lot. Now, we were interested in 10, remember, from our earlier example. But fortunately, there's a lot of overlap. Rivers, wetlands, lakes, and ponds all do learning things for these people, so they're all the same kind of education. We added this names of services because they didn't exist in the query tool and the category. But once we got rid of those overlaps, we got this kind of distribution based on those categories that I talked about earlier from the Boyd and the Millennial assessment. And then we said, okay, how do we get these 51 potential services once we got rid of the overlaps down to 10? And we relied on the Delphi survey. The Delphi survey is an expert query that goes in 2 or more rounds, where we ask the experts specific questions, and then we summarize and provide that summary information back to the experts and revise the question based on that information, and then that ideally will lead towards a trend towards consensus once we query them several times. We looked at Northern Rockies, Pacific Northwest, we asked folks from the Society of Wetland Scientists, Watershed and Wetland Councils, conservation districts, etc. And we asked them the specific question: which of these following of 51 services are important for how land use decisions are made? One's not important, five's very important. And we have 179 responses from them. We split this for now, as things are important or very important, we consider to be high ranked. Anything that's lower than that, we consider to be low ranked. But we're refining that right now as we're developing our second round of questions. But here's an example. So our high ranked one, education, ranked very high. Provisioning, not many of the provisioning services ranked high. 17 of them ranked lower. Drinking water, beneficial insects are an example of high ranked. And then the regulating, base flow support and reduction of erosion. What scored lowest in provisioning is what pharmaceuticals exist, or whether there's fur or feather ornamentation. That's kind of low. Transportation and military. These are ideas that came from the final goods and services. That's what they provided, so that's what we submitted. Carbon sequestration and microclimate scored really close to that 4 cutoff, and we'll have to have a closer look at whether we keep it. Now from that, we're going to get this down to 10. And from that 10, we're going to remember we already have functional assessments that look at the functional condition of the wetlands, and then we're going to use the output from those to look at the status of the intermediate service. Then we're going to do an assessment of the opportunities to engage with that intermediate service to come up with the condition of our final service. In this case, 1 of 10 that our experts will tell us are important. And then from that, we can look at the condition of the function, condition of the services to get to our no net loss of ecosystem functions and values, in which we're going to replace with service, so that we can adequately compensate for that and ensure that there's no loss of these things that are important to the ecological processing and important to the ecological services that maintain human well-being. And of course, to answer that first question, cultural services are really important, and they really came out as an important component when we queried our experts. Thank you very much, and I'll turn to questions.